Hello, we're going to look at how David Bohm's Implicate Order, Divination, and Vibrational Astrology are all looking at the same thing from three different points of view, and how these seemingly three different things have a lot of overlap. So first of all, David Bohm, he lived from 1917 to 1992. He was regarded as one of the most brilliant physicists in the world. So, for example, he was a very good friend of Albert Einstein, and Bohm's theory of the implicate order is A, that particles are not solid, discrete things. This was already clear and continues to be confirmed by research up until today. So, when we learn about the nature of matter, we learn that things are made of protons in the center of the atom and then electrons spinning around it, and we're given the image, that these are solid things, which makes sense because there are solid things in the world. Everything around us are things, and the ideas are made up of component little particles. Well, actually, there's a bit of an illusion there because the world looks solid. We respond to it as if it's solid. But actually, when we clap our hands or we bang against the table or whatever, it's actually an interaction of force fields, and the constituents of matter are actually not solid. Now, this may sound very, wild and crazy, but this is actually fundamental, basic ideas in science. So the standard idea of science is that things are made up of fields, not particles. So the protons, the neutrons, the electrons, and these other things are not actually solid physical things. So David Bohm emphasized that. It has now, over the years, gotten to be standard, fundamental understanding of science. The second part of Bohm's theory of the implicate order, and this is the part that's not standard yet, but is consistent with the latest findings, and I think it's gaining more attention over time, is that David Bohm proposed, is the word I'm looking for, that there is a unifying oneness, that all things are expressions from this unified implicate order. So there's an implicate order, which is the internal order, the internal structure, the internal nature of things, and there is the explicate order, which is what we experience. So what we experience is an expression of an inner order, an inner reality, an inner structure, and this is what he calls the implicate order. So we have an implicate order and an explicate order, and the implicate order is more primary. It is the foundation for the explicate order, for the external reality that we experience. So Bohm's theory is scientific. It's also spiritual. He was very influenced by the spiritual teacher Jiddu Krishnamurti and other spiritual teachers, the Dalai Lama and other people, in the development of these ideas. So it's simultaneously scientific because it's a theory that fits the data. That's the nature of science. There are observations. Can we come up with theories? Can we come up with ideas? Can we come up with models that help us make additional discoveries and that put all of our observations into a coherent framework? And David Bohm's theory of the implicate order does exactly that. And it does it in a way that's very similar to what spiritual teachers have been proposing for a long time, which is that there is a oneness, an undivided, continuous oneness behind the appearances of life. And David Bohm wrote a book, Wholeness and the Implicate Order. So it was first published in 1980. So it's a definitive resource for studying Bohm's theory in detail. It's written by him. Fortunately, he did put it into a book, and you can read the book. So if you really want to get deep into this, that's a good place to go. And his book is still very influential today, even though written back in 1980. You can go to Amazon.com, for example, and enter the book and read the reviews. You'll see people are writing reviews today that people are referring to it. A lot of people are mentioning, wow, this book is highly relevant and important even today, many years later. Now, that's what David Bohm's Implicate Order is. To summarize, it's an idea from one of the leading scientists in the 20th century, one of the very top scientists of the world, and it's essentially that there is an undivided wholeness, a oneness, that everything in the universe is connected and related to this oneness. And what I am going to talk about here in this video, in addition to the Implicate Order, is divination and vibrational astrology. And I'm suggesting here that divination is a natural consequence of the Implicate Order. Well, that's pretty straightforward if you think about it. There's an undivided wholeness, an undivided oneness. Everything is connected to everything. So if everything is connected to everything, then the things that we happen to experience, that we happen to see and notice in our lives are connected, integrated with everything. So there's very little that's completely random, or more importantly, nothing is meaningless. Everything is an explicate, or in other words, an expression of this integrated oneness and wholeness. So divinatory signs are so ubiquitous that it makes finding real astrology relationships very difficult to confirm through personal experience. In other words, so much of what we're seeing, suppose you walk down the street and you see 3 blue cars in a row, or you see some red robins or whatever it is you notice, or you hear certain sounds, they are much less random and much less meaningless than it seems. We think they're random and meaningless because we think there's no causal relationship or no structural relationship between what we happen to see and any reason for that. But actually, because of this integrated wholeness, there is meaning, there is a history, there's an interconnectedness to everything that we're seeing. And that's why divination makes sense, because there is an implicate order in which everything is connected. Nothing is coming from out of nowhere. So, I'm going to quote from some interviews of David Bohm to first make the idea of the implicate order very clear and hear it in his own words. He says, "It is not possible to analyze the world into particles." There it is, my friends. It is, let me say that again, it is not possible to analyze the world into particles. What are called particles, such as electrons, may also behave like waves, nor do they have the properties that a mechanical particle ought to have. When many of them get together, they have properties of the whole which cannot be analyzed through the parts. Relativity says that the universe cannot be divided. What David Bohm has done here is list many reasons, 3 or 4 reasons, for why the idea that there are discrete particles is not consistent with observations made in science. These so-called particles do not have the properties of a mechanical particle. Straight off the bat, they do things that mechanical, physical things would not do, and so on. So the point here is that the idea that a proton, a neutron, an electron, or other fundamental particles are actually physical, discrete things doesn't fit with the observations in science. This, by the way, is from a video called The Best of Dr. David Bohm Interview on YouTube. So he says we were supposed to consider the world made of particles. What he's saying there is, we've been told, we go to school, we're told the world is made of particles. This is what's supposed to be. and you find that the theory of relativity says that it cannot be done. So the teachers are saying, oh, things are made of particles, but relativity theory is saying it can't be made of particles. And quantum mechanics shows that the idea of entirely local properties of particles breaks down. There are peculiar relationships between particles that cannot be understood as a causal connection across the space. So he's just listing reasons why it makes no sense to think of electrons or other subatomic particles as, well, we call them particles, but we have to keep in mind they're not really particles. What they are is they are bundles of energy, is a better term for it. I'll get to that term later. But just as a preview, what is an electron? What is a proton? What is a neutron? What is the universe made of? Energy. Energy within fields. Particles are actually bundles of energy within what we can call a quantum field. This is fundamental physics. This is not woo-woo speculative stuff. These are the ideas that are reasonable based on the science of quantum theory and relativity theory and all of modern science. Again, just a few more things here. Relativity and quantum theory, the two most fundamental theories of matter, really contradict each other in the sense that relativity is local, it's causal, it's continuous. And quantum theory is just the opposite. It's non-causal, it's non-continuous, it has discrete jumps, and it is non-local. You may have heard that quantum theory and relativity theory do not work with each other. They're like two separate worlds. They are two separate worlds. They're not integrated. They are very different models. And what David Bohm is specifying here in this interview is in what way they are different models. They're just visualizing reality in such completely different ways. So with that absolute contradiction of the two basic theories, we can look for what they have in common. What they have in common is undivided wholeness. So what David Bohm is saying here is we have a problem in physics. Many of you may know about it, even if you're not scientists, just from general knowledge, that quantum theory explains the tiny world of particles. Relativity theory explains the large expanses of the universe. And when you take these two models that work extremely well, so many measurements and observations fit so well with these theories. They're extraordinarily impressive. But these two theories do not work together well. So a common sense thing to do is see, well, what do they have in common? And what David Bohm is saying is they both imply that there's an undivided wholeness. So that becomes a key to the nature of reality in which quantum theory and relativity theory can both fit. And what Bohm goes on to say is that this understanding that particles are not physical, that the idea of a particle as a separate thing, that there are these things that are separate from everything else, is not consistent with what other scientists say, such as Einstein. So David Bohm says the particle is an abstraction, according to Einstein. There's only a whole field which is undivided. So Bohm is not taking credit for coming up with the idea. He's saying it's already built into quantum theory and relativity theory. He is just making it clear. He's just articulating it and filling in the details of how this works. It is an undivided wholeness that characterizes this theory. The parts are abstractions from the whole. They have no independent existence. And this is where you see the consistency of what David Bohm proposed decades ago and the mystical vision of life as having a wholeness and a oneness. Things do not have an independent existence. The whole, in other words, the undivided wholeness is what's primary. And things like bubble up, they're like bubbles in an ocean that just bubble up out of that oneness. So that particles are not the building blocks of all things is now clearly established for anyone in the field of physics who thinks about what the formula suggests, rather than follow the motto, just calculate. You may know that there are some people in areas of physics and other sciences who do not worry, so to speak. They're not concerned about what the mathematical formulas imply about the nature of reality. They have this way that's often called just calculate. But for anybody who's thinking about what the formulas, what they imply about the nature of reality, it is very clear that particles are not physical, discrete, separate objects. And this is standard physics. So I'm going to share with you how a theoretical physicist at Cambridge University explained some of this in the year 2017. And the way he explains it is that, and it's from this video, Quantum Fields, the Real Building Blocks of the Universe, by David Tong, is the professor of theoretical physics at Cambridge University. What he says is the best theories that we have of physics do not have underlying in them the electron particle and the two quark particles. So what Professor Tong is saying is that he's just repeating what's been established for a long time and what David Bohm said decades ago, that electrons and quarks and other subatomic particles are actually not discrete, actual physical particles. To continue with what he says, in fact, the very best theories we have of physics don't rely on particles at all. The fundamental building blocks of nature are fluid-like substances which are spread throughout the entire universe and ripple in strange and interesting ways. That's the fundamental reality in which we live. These fluid-like substances we have a name for. We call them fields. So, what are tables and chairs and cars and houses and trees and you and me and everything else made of? Our first response is often atoms and, protons and neutrons and electrons, and they come together as molecules. That's abstracted out of the very real nature of reality. The actual nature of reality is that everything is fields. It's a fluid-like substance. I have this image on the left that gives, a sense of like a fluid-like moving dynamic structure. That is what reality is. If you think at all about what the formulas of quantum theory and relativity theory imply, that's it. It's very clear, very well established in science. And this fellow, Professor Tong from Cambridge University, he's just teaching standard fundamental physics, not some woo-woo speculative thing. This is it. This is what science is saying. So there is spread everywhere throughout this room something that we call the electron field. It's like a fluid. It fills this room and in fact fills the entire universe. And the ripples of this electron fluid, the ripples of the waves of this fluid get tied into little bundles of energy by the rules of quantum mechanics. And those bundles of energy are what we call the particle, the electron. Let me say it again. Those bundles of energy are what we call the particle, such as the electron. So what are particles? They are bundles of energy within this fluid-like substance that we call a field. So on the left is just an artistic image that I think gives you an intuitive sense of what we're talking about, that these waves and flow sometimes bunch together and create strong force fields, and that's what we're calling a particle. It's actually not a physical thing. So all the electrons that are in your body are not fundamental. So there are electrons, but the electrons are not the foundation of everything. They're not the bottom substrate of all of existence. They are part of the electron field. They are simply bundles of energy within the electron field. All the electrons that are in your body are waves of the same underlying field. And we're all connected to each other. Just like the waves of the ocean all belong to the same underlying ocean, the electrons in your body are ripples of the same field as the electrons in my body. So this fluid structure, this fluid material that we call a field, has waves in it, has movements. And those waves and those movements are calculated Some of it is calculated very precisely by the formulas of quantum theory. On discussing a box with all air, etc., removed. So what Dr. Tong does is he says, imagine a box with nothing in it. All the air has been sucked out. You have a nearly perfect vacuum. Is it empty? What's in that box? He says, what you are looking at here in this completely empty box, this nearly perfect vacuum, is that even when the particles are taken out, these bundles of energy that we call particles, even when they're all removed, is the field still there? Yes, the field still exists. What you're looking at here is that even when the particles are taken out, the field still exists. The field is there. But what's more, the field is governed by the rules of quantum mechanics. And there's a principle in quantum mechanics which is called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which states that you're not allowed to sit still. There are other implications of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle that you may be more familiar with, but one of them is that everything is moving. And even when there is nothing that we call a particle, the field is always there, and the field has to obey this. So even when there's nothing else, where the field is constantly bubbling and fluctuating, it's what's quite honestly a very complicated way. These are the things that we call quantum vacuum fluctuations. You may hear this term, quantum vacuum fluctuations. This is what's underlying everything. Even when you remove all of the electrons and other particles, there is always quantum vacuum fluctuation. Scientists are not yet able to create nothing. So we can draw all the oxygen and hydrogen and other parts of the air out of a box, and we can still measure fluctuations within that box. They're called the quantum vacuum fluctuations because that's what they are. It's something in a vacuum operating at what we call the quantum level. And these are not just theoretical. These quantum fluctuations that are there in the vacuum are things that we can measure. So this is what we understand about the nature of things. That quantum vacuum fluctuations, that waves within fields, is what life is made of. So science has gone from looking at the world as a physical, concrete, measurable thing into something much more amorphous, something much more energetic and less concrete, to put it mildly. Okay, it appears to me that things are made primarily by, so this is me talking, summarizing some things we can conclude from what David Bohm and Dr. Tong have said, is that it appears that things are made primarily of a unifying force that creates a field of oneness. And individual things are born from this unified field and never lose their oneness with all. That's a key thing that David Bohm emphasizes, is that the explicate order, all of the varied manifestations within life as we experience it, retain their connection with everything. They don't split off from the implicate order and become divorced from it. They never become separated. They retain their connectedness to oneness. And this is confirmed. This is consistent with all of the discoveries since David Bohm said these things back in 1980. So everything is interrelated. Nothing is purely random. Everything is drawn to us by magnetism, habit, or some other mechanism. No matter what happens in our lives, there are reasons for it. Now we can make decisions, we can choose things, we can set up different momentum and create different magnetism, and we can change our lives. I'm not saying that everything is fated, but what I'm saying is that given the decisions we've made, given the thoughts that we've chosen to have, that things are set up and nothing is happening without a context. That's a good way of putting it. Nothing is happening without a context. Everything is embedded in this oneness. So even the trivial observations of our lives, all of it is emanating or being expressed from this undivided wholeness. This is the point of view of modern science. It's also a mystical view as well. So we can choose directions in our life, and our decisions and intentions attract the myriad things in our lives. Therefore, the people you know, the place you live, and the places you visit, even the flowers you find growing in the yard of the apartment you just began renting, are not purely coincidental. I think this conclusion is reasonable based on modern science. Everything is reflecting some intention, thought, feeling, or memory. We can sense what is drawing our circumstances to us. This is what reading symbols and what we often call divination are. So divination is a way of looking at the explicate order, what's happening, and feeling, sensing, delving into how it's rooted. Where is it emanating from? Why is it emanating? There's a term, chiromancy, not the same as chiromancy, where chiro is related to time, that some people are using as well. I'll mention that again later. So yeah, I'm mentioning it right here. Robert Moss introduces that term in his book, Sidewalk Oracles. So interest in divination is huge. Tarot, I Ching, and other forms of divination are very popular. Books like Sidewalk Oracles, which is about reading signs, omens, and oracles from our everyday life experiences, a book by Robert Moss, these are all very popular. In many cultures, reading omens and oracles is an accepted part of life, rather than in modern Western astrology society, something that maybe a minority of people read into the little things that happen, read into them some form of divination. It's inherent. It's just inherent in the way they function. And that divination is so widespread and accepted in many cultures, it's not surprising, because that's a response to the nature of reality. It's not superstition. It's not some very spacey, incoherent, and illogical thing. It's based on the fact that everything is expressed from the universal, unified implicate order. Everything is dependent on the implicate order. And individuality and individual existence is an abstraction. David Bohm is extreme about this. In the interview, if you watch the interviewer asks him, but I'm here and I'm separate from you. And he says, that's an abstraction. You're not separate from me or anybody else. He says, if we put you in a room and remove all sound and all other people, you become dysfunctional. You won't even be like a human being anymore. Our thoughts, our feelings, everything is born out of interaction. An interaction from this oneness, from this undivided wholeness. So these are ideas not just of mystics and people that are highly intuitive but not logical, who are not analytical. These are ideas from the analysts, from the greatest scientists as well. So we're seeing that the mystical vision, the scientific vision are the same. There's an implicate order, a unified wholeness. So the mystics, the spiritual teachers have been saying this. A quote from a song, I Am the Bubble, Make Me the Sea by Paramahansa Yogananda from his book Cosmic Chants. Part of the lyrics are, thou and I are never apart. Wave of the sea, dissolve in the sea. I am the bubble, make me the sea. Almost identical to what Dr. Tong was saying when he said that what we experience are like waves of the ocean, and the waves are not separate from the ocean. I am the bubble. So the mystical experience very often is about simply discovering, simply realizing that you are part of this undivided wholeness, and everything is part of it. That we are not separate beings. We are part of the sea. We are a bubble, and we are the sea also. So it's a kind of illusion that we feel in the explicate order that we're separated from the undivided wholeness, and we are not. Again, what the scientists are saying, what the mystics are saying, is the same thing, and this provides a foundation for understanding why divination works and why it's important. So because everything is being drawn to us through the interconnectedness of us with everything else, and there is no way to know for certain what would happen if we were not embedded in the matrix that we are embedded in. So you and I are connected. We're connected to everything around us. It's not an accident. It's not some whim. It's not some superficial thing that has brought you to be listening to me right now. There is a deep, intricate vibrational system that we are part of this field. And it takes actually a lot of force to bring things together. A lot of direct connectedness. So the people you happen to sit down next to meet, to interact with, it's not trivial. There's a lot of force, there's a lot of meaning that's bringing anything together. Okay, we are able to establish meaning, relevance, and understanding from almost anything we experience because everything we experience is embedded in the complex history of our entire existence going back before birth. So another way to think of this is that we have consciousness before birth. Some people remember their consciousness in the womb, and even if you don't believe in past lives, we have access to information before birth. This is very well established from research on children and other people who've recalled things from before their lives, and they've been confirmed. Somehow, one way or another, we have access to information of things that we have not experienced directly and that occurred before we were born, that we have not experienced directly in these lifetimes. Our consciousness has access to many, many things. I also have a video called the Spiritual Relocational Astrology, something like this, where I share information on quantum biology and how the eye of birds, for example, and in every living thing, there are quantum effects going on. Things that are magical to the mind. So we have access to oneness. We know this from physics. We know it from quantum biology. This is how birds migrate, through quantum awareness, through access to things that are not physically connected. So we find everything, because everything's so interconnected, it's difficult to know what would happen if we were not all interconnected. When you look at an astrology chart and you notice certain things, certain history, certain things you're attracting are bringing you into this awareness, this way of thinking. Do those rules actually hold up if they were put into a computer program and you were not directly involved within that matrix? These are big questions. And if we follow the example of quantum physics, what's fascinating is that quantum physics has very precise formulas for predicting things very clearly and very specifically. So even though there's this very complex wave functions going on, it's still possible to extract out certain things. Not everything can be understood and predicted. In fact, primarily in quantum physics, only probabilities can be predicted. The probability that an electron will be in a certain place. But the formula for that probability works very well. My point is this: the fact that there's an undivided wholeness does not mean we have no access into understanding the mechanics of how it works. We do. It's just a tricky process. We have to be careful in sorting it out. Okay, so we can find meaning and helpful information in astrological symbols, even if they are not working as we think they do, if we allow our intuition to take flight. Finding rules of astrology that work just as the rules of quantum theory work is made more difficult by the implicate order. So I hope you follow what I'm saying here. We are in an implicate order. Things are being magnetized to us. Things are making sense to us because of what we've drawn together. And they could often be specific to our connection to the implicate order, our connection to the undivided wholeness. What the actual rules of astrology are that apply independent of our personal experience is a big question. But I believe astrology can do the same thing quantum physics is doing. We can find those rules. We can find the mechanisms by which things work. And data-driven research in which a model is built that is consistent with data is a way to determine the rules of astrology outside of the domain of divination. So everybody has a voice in the choir. Everything has a part to play in it. The empirical research approach is very, very important and relevant for teasing out what the actual connections are, what the formulas are, and how things function. How they function independent of any one particular astrologer's immersion in the activity. So again, this is similar to physics, in which quantum theory provides exceptionally accurate formulas for predicting particular behaviors of things, but also leaves some things as mysteries that transcend human understanding. So there are limits to what quantum physics can do. There are limits to what astrology can do. Very often there's only a probability of the specific result, but probabilities can be important. If I know there's a 75% or 90% probability that an accident will occur, or a certain activity will happen in a certain place, that's extremely helpful. So these things can be discovered, and they are being discovered. If you're familiar with some of the research we've done and that other people are doing, we are mapping out how things work through this data-driven approach, where the theories fit the data. So the formulas in quantum physics work extremely well, but it's not possible to fully make sense of the formulas in terms of what make practical sense to humans. For example, in relativity theory, we have the idea that time is not separate from space. And also, if one travels very fast, time is affected. But to us, time is experienced as something that is an objective external fact of life, and the tick-tock of a watch does not seem like it would be changed by traveling fast. But the speed of that tick-tock of the watch is changed when something approaches the speed of light. So what I'm saying is, as you no doubt already know, many of the ideas in quantum theory and in relativity theory, they just don't make sense to our minds, to our common sense. And that's because of the limitations of the human experience. So, vibrational astrology is similar to modern physics in that, let's see, I think this is my last slide. Yes, it is. To summarize some key points here. Vibrational astrology, specifically vibrational astrology, is very similar to modern physics in the following ways. Number one, the foundation of reality is fields and waves, not particles. So what vibrational astrology proposes, that waves, that this complex interaction of wave patterns is fundamental. Rather than putting so much emphasis on something physical and tangible, is the same as what has happened in science, where it has moved from an emphasis on the physical, the material, to the emphasis on fields and waves within the fields. It's just interesting. Number two, astrology, I should say vibrational astrology is anchored in the fundamental nature of things, that everything is an indivisible unity. Vibrations are always active, even in a vacuum. Waves within the field are a fundamental driving force of nature. So, everything is an indivisible unity. We all participate in the wave functions created by the universe and the movement of the planets in the sky. 3, as described in the video, A New Theoretical Framework for Astrology. This is another video that I've made where I discuss some things that I'm not mentioning in this video. In particular, I go into some detail in that video on the structures in space. I'm not going into that here, but in addition to waves, there are structures in space. These structures in space can be called fractal sacred geometry. Zodiac signs and houses are structures in space, and vibrational astrology theory is consistent and is parallel to the ideas on the nature of reality as scientists understand them today. So there's many ways in which vibrational astrology speaks the same language as modern science. And in the video, A New Theoretical Framework for Astrology, you will discover some additional ways that vibrational astrology uses the same concepts, the same theoretical framework that modern science uses, and in particular, in addition to the idea that there are fields and there are waves within the fields, that there are structures in space, and the fundamental importance of space and what we mean by space are all covered in that other video. Okay, what are we up to? Number 4 here: science, astrology, mysticism, and spirituality. These are things that people often look at as very different, like spirituality and science. Oh, they're very, very different. You know, most scientists seem to be skeptical of astrology, skeptical of spirituality. So science, astrology, mysticism, and spirituality are all different lenses into the same undivided wholeness. You really feel this in the writings of people like David Bohm. It's a lens into the undivided wholeness. Vibrational astrology is a form of spiritual astrology for the 21st century and beyond. And the view of vibrational astrology is that we as individuals are choosing within a probability field. And we are part of this undivided wholeness. And what we are is much less physical. And the emphasis in a lot of astrology on, oh, you have Aries, so you're fiery, you are, aggressive, or like, certain things are likely to happen, and you have certain kind of personality. Actually, all of those personality things and characteristics are emanations in the explicate order of something very fundamental, the driving momentum and meaning and purpose, which we have identified in great detail in vibrational astrology. Exactly what the planets are doing, what Venus is doing. It's part of a wave function with a momentum and a purpose. And that might sound abstract, but we have it down very clearly and very practical and applicable in your chart interpretation. A whole new language of astrology based on the idea that astrology, just like everything else in life, as explained in modern science, is based on waves and an undivided wholeness and fields within which those waves exist. And lastly, VA is data-driven and evidence-based. So you're probably familiar with the fact that we go through databases, we find what's consistent, we build models that actually match the data. We don't say, Leo is dramatic and they tend to be actors, because we've looked at the data. We have thousands and thousands and thousands of data in our databases, and it's not true. We don't see that actors have more Leo than other zodiac signs. So we have to throw it out. It doesn't match the data. So we can't go by theory alone. We're very data-driven and evidence-based. And this strikes some people as peculiar, that we can be so scientific, so nerdy, so number-oriented, so empirical. And doesn't that contradict the idea of being intuitive, of being psychic, of being mystical, of being visionary, of being idealistic and a vision of oneness of all? No. It's all completely consistent. All completely consistent. And some spiritual teachers, for example, Paramahansa Yogananda, in his book Autobiography of a Yogi, he gives attention and honor to some of the great scientists as well as mystics with the same enthusiasm in the same stream of thought. That intelligence, illumination come in many forms. So what we're seeing here is an undivided wholeness in which all these things participate together. And being data-driven and evidence-based is an essential component to make the whole thing work properly. And not only does it not fight against or contradict or provide an opposing view to the mystical vision, it enhances it and it's part of it. So it's a new way of thinking. All of this is completely consistent with the work of David Bohm. We showed the video of Dr. Tong or any number of other great scientists today, that this is how we understand life and the vision of where we're headed and what works and is helpful in any area of endeavor in the 21st century using the latest understanding of the nature of reality. So mysticism, astrology, magic, divination, science, math are all integrating and cohering together as different lenses into the same fundamental reality. And I think it's changing the nature of astrology, and that vibrational astrology is a future for astrology that enters into this new world. Thank you very much for listening, my friends. God bless. Namaste.